Hello, everyone. My name is Marek, and I'm the CEO at Netguru, and I have a huge pleasure to welcome everyone to yet another episode of Disruption Talks, where we invite top experts to discuss digital acceleration, winning strategies, innovation, and scaling products. And today we have a very special guest, James Carroll, Senior Vice President of Digital Services at Mastercard. Hello, James.
Hi, guys.
And the topic for today is how Mastercard is shaping the digital innovation landscape. And usually we start the show with the introduction of the company and the speaker. And when I was thinking about this part of our conversation, on one hand, I thought everyone knows Mastercard. And we all know Mastercard as a company that does this, for example. Some of us know Mastercard as a company that helps us move from physical to digital. But I think this is way too simplified description of what Mastercard is. James, if you could tell us in few sentences what Mastercard does. We all know it's not about physical cards anymore.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you guys today. Going back a number of years ago, like I'm in Mastercard now, just 9 years next month. And when I first came to Mastercard, there were people were talking about, will the card disappear? And we used to talk about beyond the card, and the last 9 years have shown how, while the form factor may change, as in, for instance, you have a token now on your phone that allows you to do payments with your phone, the payment network still works, right? And the payment networks of us and our competitors and that is a global payment network. Mastercard has something like, you hear stats often where people talk about Facebook has 2 billion plus members, etc. Mastercard has something like 2.3 billion cardholders around the world. And so the power of that network is about trust and safety. But we talk about, going back a number of years ago, they used to talk about who is your competitor, and our former CEO used to talk about the competitor was cash, right? And that was the enemy, and how do we move away from cash? We now, in the new vision that Mastercard has publicly announced over the last number of months, we talk about powering economies and empowering people. And if you think about that, we're about the infrastructure, right? We are a network. We're a safe network. That's a huge deal. In many ways, you look and you could say Mastercard is 50 something years old now, 55 or something like that. And we talk about building a sustainable economy where everybody prospers, right? So we do work all around the world, for instance, helping the unbanked, but equally we're a very safe network. When you use your card or your phone or whatever Mastercard service you are, you have huge comfort that the money will arrive. It'll pay the bill, or whoever's waiting for the money will get it. And that's a huge comfort. And then in terms of priorities, we talk about our focus is expanding in payments, extending services. Service is a huge part of Mastercard's business now, and we have a big ambition there to double our services by 2030, and embracing new networks. Those of you who know the payments world will have seen that we made several big acquisitions over the last number of years in open banking, in a company called Vocalink in the UK, which is about the debit network, a company called Nets in the Nordics. And so that whole idea of expanding our rails to embrace new forms of payment, are new forms of look at data, you look at cyber, like that. When you look at Mastercard and you strip it back, you say, well, it has huge comfort or huge capabilities in the cyberspace, huge capabilities in the data space, huge capabilities in the loyalty space, in terms of helping our customers acquire, engage, and retain customers for profitable effect. And then obviously payments at the core of the engine.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for the introduction. And I think that illustrates very well also the journey you have been through. So thinking the first competitor was cash, right now is much broader than this. And maybe just for the sake of the introduction, if you could tell us a bit about you and your role within Mastercard.
Yeah, sure. So my wife sometimes asks me, she says, why are you in tech? You can't wire a plug, right? So my origins, my first the first company I worked with, I had a business degree and focused on accounting and marketing, and I got hired by a company called Digital Equipment. And those of you who are have grey hair like myself will remember Digital Equipment. Digital Equipment was the #2 computer company in the world after IBM back in the 80s. And it was run by a famous gentleman called Ken Olsen. And at that time, he was like, a Steve Jobs type character, brilliant, brilliant man. And he built digital into a huge company making mini computers. But he was also famous for that famous saying that why would anybody want a PC in every home? And not too many years, a couple of years after he said that, digital disappeared. And so I was hired by Digital. I worked in process engineering in a warehouse. My first job was as a process engineer in an automated warehouse where we were setting up a total sort of new high-end tech warehouse up in Galway in the west of the country. And I spent 4 years there, and then I worked with Digital in Holland, in Utrecht. For a year. Then I moved to Australia for a number of years. I moved on I got into corporate recovery there, turning around small businesses on behalf of investors. Came back here, ended up in a company called Modus Media as the internet was coming on big time. Modus Media was a huge global printer owned by R. Donnelly. And they used to, because they were printers, it was always about the smell of the brochure and the feel of the brochure. But digital was, the internet was coming, and they were going, is this internet thing really going to happen? I mean, there's, I suppose similarities today if people go, is that metaverse really going to happen? Like, is that a thing? But I worked in that space. I was European marketing director in Modus Media, and it was big supply chain business. And then subsequently left Modus Media and joined a company called Orbiscom. And Orbiscom was a payments technology company. Actually, Orbiscom was the company, it was a Dublin-based company and its origins were that whole idea of tokenization. So they used to have a one transaction number, and you could have a picture of your credit card or on your browser. And when you went to shop, you could pick it up, and the number spun like a slot machine, but you got a one transaction number. And so I developed a whole platform in business payments that linked the invoice to delivery docket and the payment number to take paper out of the process. And subsequently, Orbiscom was acquired by Mastercard, and that business today, that particular business, does about 30 billion throughput. And I designed a lot of the technology infrastructure, if you like, in terms of how that process worked, particularly for business payments. Subsequently, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm an entrepreneur now today in Mastercard. And I built a business that I was in the property business, and we built a corporate venturing business where we set up a whole range of different businesses, some successful, some not. We raised a property fund in 2008, right just when the world started to have a meltdown. In fact, we signed on New Year's Eve 2009, so I think we were the only fund globally that closed during that period. And thankfully, I'd say we were one of the few funds in the world in 2008 that actually ended up where our investors all got their money back. And so that was a big success. And then I joined Mastercard 9 years ago. And we joined because Mastercard Labs at the time was, doing lots of innovation stuff internally in Mastercard, and it has driven a lot of the innovation agenda within Mastercard and made sort of innovation socially acceptable, if you like, within the company. And I was speaking to the guy who hired me at the time, and he was saying, look, we have customers coming to Dublin or New York where we have labs, and they'd say, God, this is amazing what you're doing in Mastercard. Could you come and help us do the same thing? So we set up a group called Mastercard Labs as a Service, focused on product innovation and digital transformation. And we built that business to where it now has teams in about 15 countries globally. It was focused very specifically on product innovation. But we're part of a division that also has a big consulting practice. So we're now part of what they call Consulting Innovation Services. So we do everything from soup to nuts, from strategy, payment strategy, data strategy, general strategy, business strategy, right through to taking concepts and turning them into prototypes, and prototypes into pilots, and pilots into scalable businesses. And we do that across the globe, and we've had recent success since we set that up. It's an internal joint venture, if you like, between what is called Data and Services, which is probably like it's a very big, several $billion business in Mastercard, and between what's now called Mastercard Lab. It used to be Mastercard Labs, now called Mastercard Foundry. So we very much have. I used to joke that we had the two dysfunctional parents, but we have the very strong innovation DNA, and then on the other side, a brilliant consulting company who've been around for many years, and then we have their footprint as well. So it's a reasonably successful business.
It is, and when you were explaining both the company and your journey, I think there are many really interesting threads I would like to pick up today. So let's try to mold it into like 3 spheres we can talk about. First, the wider market, then how Mastercard plays in the wider market, and then how your team and yourself are helping this materialize. So if you think about the wider market, I think the biggest, and you talked already that you've been in part of the company that was betting on PCs not coming to our homes. Then you were part of the company that was betting on the internet not becoming a great thing. And right now, if you see the trends, like what are the most impactful trends you see in the market today that are going to impact our lives, but also Mastercard?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. So when I joined Mastercard, I think it was the whole idea of payments innovation was only emerging. We often say, when you get out of an Uber taxi or a similar brand, you still feel like you got away with it, right? Mm-hmm. Because the payments is going into the background. But what we see is we operate on the axis, and particularly my team, but so does Mastercard today. We operate on an axis that is where payments meets commerce, where content meets context, and where data meets business intelligence and our business insight. And traditionally, those things were separate. Those people have been around long enough because the way organizations were organized. The payments people, for instance, never talked to the marketing people, as an example, or the marketing people wouldn't be talking to the data people. They'd say, that's nothing to do with us, right? But today, those things are all, there's a sort of like a crossroads, right? And we operate on that crossroads. And so payment is absolutely one end of a transaction, but at the other end, it's about user experience, right? And that's often where, like in my team, as we go around the world, the problems, we say the faces change, but the problems stay the same. If you're in an emerging market, you may be further up the mountain or lower down in the mountain, but it's the same sort of problem. So we don't see, if you listed, and the example I've often used is when you look at the emergence of payments wallets, right? And going back a number of years ago, when I first joined Mastercard, probably 7 years ago, wallets were, everybody's going on about wallets, right? But I just say, look, if you took all the best wallets in the world and you put the features down on one table, there's only about 10 core features. And then maybe depending on the sponsor, there's things, someone might be more into loyalty or more into whatever. But the digital wallet effectively is the digital interface for many customers, right? So that's the axis that we've worked on, and we've worked all around the globe. And in the group I'm in now, between the consulting side and my team side, who do the prototyping and all that sort of stuff, we've probably done 2,000 different engagements all around the world, and we characterize ourselves, or have always done. We're called Digital Labs now, or that team, the team I set up, and I'm in transition into a new role in Mastercard Ventures, but I'll come back to that. But we characterize ourselves as like Sherpas in the process of digital transformation. And I've often said, when if you arrived up to the mountain today and you said, Sherpa came down off Mount Everest and said, it's my first day in the job, I'll take you up, you'd probably say, I'll wait for the experienced person. So as we go around the world, we see the trends, right? And sometimes, depending on what if you listed the trends, Marek, or if the people listening, if we all said, right, we'll spend 5 minutes and write down the trends, I bet you there'll be 80 to 90% commonality. So Absolutely. People are not struggling with the trends, because you can read, Gartner or Mary Meeker at the start of the year or whatever, and you can, well, they're the key things. What they struggle with is, how do we apply those new technologies to our business? And that's what we are. We're practitioners, and we're Sherpas in the sense of, we know where the bodies are buried, if you like. We know the mistakes people have made, because as we go around the world, what we do is we create intimacy and trust with customers. They tell us their problems. Everything starts with that, at the customer problem. So we're practitioners in the sense, on the street. We're not theoretical guys writing, or girls writing 200 PowerPoint slides. We're always about, how do you rapidly prototype? We're about using agile. We're about using design thinking. We often, we run a program called Launchpad in our team, which is a 1 week rapid prototyping, rapid design sprint. Now, Netguru does that as a daily thing, I'm sure, daily sprints, etc. But when we first were doing that, the Google Sprint book had just come out, and for any of those who aren't au fait with this stuff, they should look at that, or look at Lean Startup by Eric Ries. Another gives you insight into this stuff. But back then, it wasn't, Agile was around, but the process of design thinking and first principles design thinking wasn't really around. But when we run those 1 week prototyping sprints, we're often talking to customers at the start of the week, where we'll pull them off the street and get feedback on the problems they're having on a particular with a particular problem statement. And then we get to the end of the week, we're often bringing in customers again to show them the outputs of what we've done. So we're getting immediate feedback. So I think that's often missed in technology. People get too fascinated with, I've got a beautiful mousetrap. Mousetrap is no good if it doesn't catch mice, right? And so we're always about starting with the customer, understanding the customer needs, and then wherever possible, like we describe ourselves as like the tip of the spear for Mastercard. So we say when the tip of the spear hits you, it's not the tip of the spear kills you, it's the power behind it and the ability. And we're so lucky because in Mastercard, there's just, people think, oh, well, it's just a network, or, oh, well, they just do data stuff, or, oh, they do cyber stuff. But actually, Mastercard is this amazing company who's very, very innovative internally. And there's gold in the hills, right? Now, sometimes it takes a while to find it, right? But because of the job we do, we're connected to all that around the world. And so we're sitting in let's say, with a customer in Bogota in Colombia, and they have a particular problem. If we don't know the solution, we can reach into Mastercard and we can bring all sorts of capabilities to the table. And that's ultimately what is a force accelerator for the customer.
It's super interesting because on one hand, what I take away from what you said, the interesting stuff, or the key stuff rather, one is that we all know the trends, like we all see the trends, we can all read about them, but I think your approach is like very pragmatic, like how actually apply the way to build solutions in a very structured way, in a very efficient way, to address the trends that we know that exist there. And I think something that you also mentioned that was is quite unusual in the industry is that the method matters a lot, right? That you said a lot about design thinking, you said a lot about agile, about making sure that the solution you build is exactly fitting the problem that you have identified. So it's not only about knowing the trends, but knowing how to respond to the trends and build the solutions. And we actually have a ton of questions from the audience already. And the first one is around your vision or your how you see the future of cash. It's a question from Radek. Hi, gentlemen. Got a question to both of you. Is it an inevitable eventuality that peak digitalization means no more physical cash? What do you think, James?
Yeah, it's interesting. In recent days in Ireland, there was a pensioner who went in to pay some bill, and I think it was a government-related bill of some sort, and I think it was car tax or something, and the department said we don't take cash anymore, and the airways went crazy because not everybody is, let's say, digital au fait, right? But on the other side, I said two things, and COVID drove a huge acceleration in the move away from cash, obviously, partly because of that thing of fear, right? But partly because ultimately, when you couldn't meet face to face, digitization is the only way to enable you to transact, right? Now, I would say a couple of things, depending on who you're listening to. Like the digital genie is never going back in the bottle, right? And then depending on who you talk to, people say, oh, it's like, sure, the world has gone crazy. We're already at the far end of that cycle. We're not. We're at the bare beginning of that cycle. And I'll come back to that in a moment. When you come back to the question on cash, is there going to be less and less cash? Well, you see it in countries like, I was looking at some stats a couple of weeks ago. In Thailand, they went from basically 90% cash usage. And in COVID, it flipped the other way around, where now it's 90% digital. So I don't think that trend will ever reverse. Will cash totally go away? Well, who knows? Again, we had in Ireland just last week where they've mandated that all taxi drivers have to now accept cards, and they were having problems where certain taxi drivers were being brought up by the government because they weren't accepting cash. And the guy on from the taxi association was saying, oh, it's because they're old and they don't know how to use the technology and all that. Well, like, like the reality is, we all loved cash, right? If you were in a cash business, I had a cash business when I was young. It was a restaurant. You could live on a cash business that you can't if you're non-cash quite as much, because the government, that gets a piece of everything you do. But that's the correct way to go. So I think the wave that tide is coming in. It will it ever totally end and will cash disappear? Well, in lots of countries, certainly pre-COVID, I know a guy who runs conferences for central bank for the central bank organizations all around the world, and he said, you guys are talking about the enemy being cash, but he said we love cash because that's what powers all the economies. Today it powers a lot less economies than it did 2 years ago before COVID. So I think that trend is definitely is here to stay. We don't talk about the enemy being cash anymore. Say we talk about empowering economies and enabling people to transact, and that's the key piece. I mean, back to that Uber example. You get out of the Uber, do you say, "Oh God, I wish I'd had the cash to pay him"? You don't. Just go. And my wife still says, we get out of the taxi, what, like, how does that happen? And it's as if it's magic, but that's the reality. Is payments are going into the background, but they're absolutely critical to commerce, right? That's the reality of payments infrastructure. And that thing of knowing that my money is safe, or if I transact with you, Marek, that you're going to receive the money, that's a huge balance to the thing of, I wish I had a few shillings in my pocket. And today, I think far less people have money in their pocket, cash in their pocket, than they did a number of years ago.
Fully agreed. And the question was also to me, I think cash is going to almost disappear, and gradually disappear. But I mean, back to your comment on trust, I think it's critical. Like we were okay with cash because it was conveying trust in this in the bill that we were handing over to another person. And when we go digital, it's 100% around trust, because if we didn't have trust in the application or payment method when paying digitally online, we wouldn't do that. We would look for alternatives. So I think trust as a significant feature, or not feature, or requirement in any payment provider is really, really critical. And another question actually from the audience as well. You mentioned that the data is an important element right now of your strategy. And a question from Maciek is how Mastercard monetizes data. Are 3 value-added services that merchants can benefit from? Are there 3 value-added services?
Yeah, well, the first thing is, when you look at what's happened in data over recent years, and we all thought, I remember seeing there used to be a thing on the internet where it was a guy in Times Square, and it said, just watch this, he's driving in his car, and about every 2 seconds you're hearing a ping, right? And they said, what are all those pings? It's actually someone is tracking, someone knows you're passing their shop, as an example, right? Yeah. But the thing is, Mastercard anonymizes all its data, right? So that's a huge thing in terms of having integrity about how we manage data, the data lake, if you like, because we see, like, we produce reports in the States that are anonymized. So it doesn't say, Marek is, after buying a set of golf clubs down there. But what it says is maybe there's an ABC1 type profile, and we can see, like in the US is a good example, where we see, and this is in certain countries, certainly all the countries that we do switching, if those who understand what switching is, but we're like a proxy for spend. So we produce reports in the States that are publicly available reports, where the government has to see them beforehand, because they're a they're a forecaster, if you like, of what's happening in the economy. So from that point of view, we have a big data business working with banks, often helping them to better understand their data. So it's a capability rather than saying, are we taking Marek's data and giving it to a merchant? We can't do that, right? So we don't do that. On the other hand, we are working with merchants internationally that if you took, here's a good example. We helped build a system in the States by one of the biggest banks. And the idea was that if you were, let's say you were a pizza maker in Charlotte, in North Carolina, and it's a quiet Monday night, but that you could see the sort of data that says, well, actually, in those regions, in those other parts of Charlotte, there's people are doing a lot of business, or they're doing it, we'd have extra data that might say they're making offers or whatever. So if you repeat owner, then you could say, okay, I can use that type of data, and not totally anonymized data, to go, I think I'm going to drop my price, or I'm going to give some incentives, right? So we're working with merchants in that regard, in that way, or with some very big merchants who'd say, can we take our data and any data you have that's generic data about what's happening in our region? So it's like a heat map. And we'll map them together and see, can you make 1 and 1 makes 3? And there's lots of that going on. But again, it is all anonymized. And Mastercard, when I watched, we don't know actually the way our data is being used, right? We just don't know. And what, some of the stuff Cambridge Analytica and others have proven, that you think, well, it's a bit like going to the doctor. You say, I trust my doctor, I trust my banker. But 2008 taught us that sometimes bankers have issues about how they're using information, or what they're doing with us. In the data field, there have been like multiple examples, as we've seen, where data has been misused. And so you're going to get a lot more regulation, rightly so, I think, that ultimately the owner of the data is you, right? It's a really interesting company we work with called Me Prism, based out of New York. And the whole idea is that, let's say I have my own data vault, and I might have my medical persona, or my financial persona, or my whatever persona, and all that data is owned by me. Some of the people who are in the younger demographic are quite happy for people to have their data, but what we see emerging is the index is definitely moving back to the person, to the individual, and the idea that you could store all your data, but then you could say, well, I can release some of that data, and if someone monetizes it, I'm going to share in the monetization value. That's a trend that certainly I think will happen. It'll be driven by regulation. And this idea that, be it the Googles or whoever, can own your data and do whatever they like with it, and that you don't know what are they doing with it, that's definitely going to move away. And there's going to be far more regulation. I think that's good. We're not worried about that in Mastercard, because we think we're the high bar. And in fairness, banks in the same way. Like if you look at my daughter a couple of years ago, when Revolut first came out, and she said, we have to get a Revolut. She got a Revolut card. And then she was getting a job, a part-time job, and she said, I need to get a bank account. And there's this sort of false assumption or urban myth that younger demographics, want all this new stuff, right? And I said, but you've got a Revolut card, just give them the Revolut details. And she said, Daddy, I can't be telling my friends that I don't have a bank account. And so, of course, she went to the bank that her dad and mom were in. And so that thing of trust and intimacy, and who can I trust with my deep content and data, that still is like the banking industry isn't going away. And Mastercard took a very strong view in that a number of years ago, where some people say, oh, banks are going to be disintermediated, the world's going to turn upside down. It's all this frighten the life out of your forecasting. And the reality is that hasn't happened, and banks are still there. Now, will some banks disappear because they don't move with the times of, the changing face of digital and payments and commerce? Absolutely. But in terms of Mastercard, we have very strong practices around that, and we're probably one of the, I would say, would be in the top companies in the world in terms of how we manage and work with data.
Yeah, and I think that the common theme for this talk is about trust. Like when you talked about data, is again, trust is critical, and I think this is really essential. And there's a question there's again a question from the audience that we should be predicting is going to happen. Question from Mark. Thank you, James, for great insights. What's your view on ChatGPT?
Yeah, well, I love it. But here's the thing, right? So it's a bit like, I'm old enough to remember when mobile phones first came along, and you'd watch people walking down the street which looked like they had a block tied to the ear, and you'd be laughing at them, right? And people forget how far technology moves, right? And so today, when you look at, let's call it AI in general, you have everything from the doomsdayers, even the Elon Musk's of the world going, oh, AI is going to take over the world, and we're all going to be, it's robots will rule us and all that stuff. I don't believe any of that, right? The reality is that the ChatGPTs of the world will solve problems. Like I was with a guy yesterday who's in the chat business, right? He has a like chat, a whole range of customers in that space where he's helping them with a dynamic chat and automated chat, and he's now looking at taking ChatGPT and getting it to augment stuff he does. So he works in the mortgage space, for instance, and he's saying, right, ChatGPT can answer, for instance, you can use it to listen. First of all, they're listening to all the conversations that their customers are having. So let's say it could be on customer service and are listening to the sales agents. They're capturing all that information. And then they're using ChatGPT to get further insight on that information so that they can summarize it and they can get the lessons out of it, right? At the same time, I often say we're living in the land of the blind where the one-eyed man or woman is king or queen, respectively, right? What that means is there's an awful lot of nonsense spouted about things like ChatGPT, right? And when you look at the content out there, you have to find the signal in the noise, because people love to talk about the latest, greatest thing. But sometimes, in my opinion, too often you have people opining on stuff that they don't understand. You know, I often make the example of in innovation. A lot of consultants, if you're reading what they talk about in innovation, you think that you could take a pill to fix yourself, right? And I used to always say, look, the best companies have always innovated. Innovation isn't some new thing. Like going back, you know, many, many years, my dad he's passed since, but he brought some of the first computers ever into Ireland, right? And technology. So that was back in the 60s, right? So like innovation happens all the time. However, what's the change between, say, back then and now is the speed of change, right? We see it in the metaverse, or something like ChatGPT. So people look at ChatGPT today, and you know, when Google came out with their test product there a couple of weeks ago, and everybody freaks out and says, "Oh, it answered the question wrong, or it gets stuff wrong." Of course, it does. The chat engines are based on what they're watching, stuff that's out there, and they're learning. But a bit like, you know, if I pick my 9-year-old, he knows less than my 21-year-old, right? So it takes time to learn, and those engines are learning. And will they become absolutely? Is there huge value add in them? Absolutely, there is. The use cases, you know, it's back like when the internet came along. People used to talk about the internet was like the big bogeyman, right? I often say that, you know, when Sir Thomas More was brought to the Tower of London and they were about to hang him, they said, have you anything to say? He said, it's the long walk to the gallows concentrates the mind, right? And there's an element of that in technology today that, you know, there are first movers, some of whom make mistakes, like in the internet we did. Like we had, you know, I was speaking in Mexico a couple of years ago before COVID, and I was looking at the audience was, you know, in my view, like they were a lot younger than me. And I was saying people have no memory. They have a very short memory in the digital world. Like when the .com collapse happened, the Collison brothers, I think, were like 12 and 14 respectively, right? So it's a very short time ago. And will there be ups and downs? You know, they talk about the valley of despair in technology. You know, absolutely there will be. Will there be less hard lessons learned in using the tools like ChatGPT? Absolutely there will be. But is there huge value add? I can tell you, like you look at kids doing their homework today, and in ways you go, and they're using ChatGPT to get them, say, at least a good bit of the way. Well, like what's wrong with that? It's about insight, right? And I think, like everything, when the internet first came along, I remember retailers and they become that internet thing we're not doing. And then eventually they said, okay, we'll hire some guys in the attic or girls in the attic and we'll do some internet stuff and we'll do commerce. And eventually over a number of years, they got them down onto the main floor. But up to quite recently, a lot of merchants, you still talk about e-commerce and retailing as if they were two different things. It's the same thing. Like we see it today in the metaverse, where people talk about, oh, it's all VR. Nobody's going to wear those VR headsets. But actually, where the big change is coming, it's about where the real world meets the digital world. And it's about value-added capability. And I think often the forecasters just get it wrong and misunderstand what's happening with some of these new technologies.
It's very true. I think it's also about the cycle of innovation. Because for AI, I feel that we were waiting for so many years for something like with very wide application to happen that we can all use AI on daily basis. And then ChatGPT is this thing that anyone can use, interact with AI in the way they didn't think they can. So right now there's this big hype around it. And I think as you said, like partially for a good reason, because it can make us much more productive, but partially it's a hype. It won't solve all of our problems. And you touched about metaverse already, and there's actually a question from Sean, one of my Netguru colleagues, who was supposed to lead this show with you initially. Thank you, Sean, for letting me be the host today. So remaining on the topic of digital and trust, I would like to talk about everyone's favorite buzzword, metaverse. And the question is how to build payments in that space, but more along the lines of how to approach regulation in a fully digital environment, since we already have so much legislation and difficulty in the physical world of payments.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question. When you look at so payments, firstly, some of you may have seen Mastercard made a big announcement about a company called Exola, who are a network player in gaming, and they are probably one of the leading engines behind a lot of the gaming engines to enable people to transact, right? But a lot of the gaming engines, while some of them they take your card on file, etc., but they probably hadn't had the interfaces. A bit like when going back even in the last couple of years, crypto didn't have easy interfaces to the traditional payments network, to fiat currencies, right? So, like when we look at, I've said I'm lucky. I have a small team who operate in this space in future tech, but particularly around the metaverse. And a fellow called Keith Jordan, if any of you guys want to follow him, is probably, in my view, he's one of the leading experts globally in this space about where the trends are going and what's happening. But I used to say to Keith when we first started this is, look, one of the days some senior manager is going to, could be the CEO, Michael Meeback, say, what the hell are we doing in the metaverse? And between us, and he came up with the idea, was that when you look at where can Mastercard play in the metaverse, where we're saying we have a vision that hopefully Mastercard will be one of the leading players in payments, one of the leading players in cyber, one of the leading players in data, and one of the leading players in loyalty in the metaverse and digital ID in the medium to longer term, right? Because that's our core competence. And it's a good example where in Mastercard Ventures, we're looking creating new ventures that leverage the core, but create breakthrough businesses that are sort of, that don't rely on everything that's in Mastercard, but leverage everything that's in Mastercard, right? On the issue of regulation, we've seen, like the Cambridge Analytica examples, or lots of other examples, and watched leading CEOs of the leading companies in the world in speaking to Congress in the US. Basically, I would say, I won't say telling little white lies, but I took about the sin of omission is just as bad as telling a lie, right? Of not explaining properly the knowledge that they have and what they're doing with their data. There are similar challenges, I imagine, in gaming, and the companies like Roblox and others. When I watch, I watch my youngest playing games. Do we know what's really? Are they protecting the kids? All that sort of stuff. So, I think regulation, the same as we've seen in like you look in Europe in GDPR, and then or in even open banking, the world has followed Europe's lead in that. California have a special act around data, etc. And then similarly here, I would say we don't know what we don't know today. And the regulators haven't managed to get under the hood, because even, if you put 10 people in the room, 5 of them will tell you the metaverse is just, that's 5 to 10 years out. 5 of them, if they're gamers, they'll believe it exists today. But the actual practices under the hood are not understood. And I think, if anything, regulation will be a positive force in that regard. And it's back down to the same conversation we had earlier in terms of data, managing that and making sure that there's oversight and that there's independence and that people are not taking advantage of is a trend that's going to come more, and rightly so.
That's true. And I also see like you, I also see the regulation as being something that can be something positive and protective for the users. I think the biggest challenge right now is that the pace of innovation is faster than ever. So it's really hard to catch up with regulation, because metaverse is still a relatively new concept, and then first payments are starting to happen there. And something that also struck me when we chatted the last time, you mentioned about the trend in China. I had no idea that existed, that there are payments happening for live
commerce, streaming commerce.
Live commerce, exactly. Can you tell us more about this trend? Because it's something for Europeans and Americans, I think, quite unknown.
Yeah, I think, Ireland's a good example where they talk about us being the 52nd state. So everybody's always looking west. What are they doing in Silicon Valley? And Like we run a program called Digital Safari as an example, and we bring customers to the valley and we show them what's going on, and the program is focused on provocation, foresight, thought leadership, and insight, right? And so people are always looking west, but I've always had a view when you look at, and AI is a good example, in a positive and negative way, right? You look at TikTok and how far TikTok know more about your kids than you do, right? That's right. So I've always also looked east, right? Going way back even. I went to China. The first time I went to China was probably around 2000, because when it started to unlock, you talk about speed. They moved the dial. So we've seen huge companies emerging in the last number of years, from the Alibabas of the world to the Ping Angs, etc. Right? But so I had a team out in just prior to COVID. I was watching a trend that I thought was emerging, was what they call live commerce. So think of it as like where QVC meets Facebook, meets the internet, right? And so I sent the team out there, and we started looking at that. And we've now partnered with a company called Andlux, and they have a platform called Wonder, and they're probably two of the leading SMEs in the world who, for instance, when Alibaba and Tmall do anything in the US, they come to these guys. But the idea is that it's just a live stream, and it could be, let's say, you standing in your shoe shop, and you're picking up the shoes, and you have a phone, and it's like the TikTok thing, but you can transact in the stream, so that, and it's social, so that you can see what other people are buying, or you can see your friends, or you can make recommendations. When COVID happened in China, when retailers here, they all closed down, and those who had good e-commerce sites kept going, but really they were, their business was hugely affected. In China, it was not affected much at all. Today, and I don't know what the exact stats are, but for everybody who transacts in e-commerce in China, let's say in the last year, something like 75 to 80% of them have been on a live stream at some point in time, right? And so when COVID came, the staff, the girls and boys in these shops, they kept coming to work, and they were streaming from the end of their makeup counter or the clothes counter or whatever it might be. There were farmers selling their goods, just standing out in the middle of the field with a mobile phone, but connected to the Tmall platform, where they could sell their goods, but either in China or exporting. There was a famous story of it. It was a pearl fisherman, and he started from nothing, just showing how you could catch how you get the shells and how you take the pearls out. Became like it's a 24-hour channel today, right? And exporting all over the world. So we believe that trend is coming this way. We've invested in it, and I'd say with scars on our backs in terms of learning lessons with various vendors, etc. But we think when you look at, for instance, and back to the metaverse, you think people talk about so we have this concept of the metamal, but when you look for examples around the world, there's no good examples. That's some crazy stuff. People who set up banks and they put a tiger in it, and they think that's sensible. I don't know, what they're smoking, but we believe that commerce in the metaverse is going to happen. It's already happening, and examples when you look at it for leading trends, like you look at RTFKT, where Nike acquired that company only a couple of years ago, and they paid, like, depending who you listen to, anywhere from $1.5 billion to $2 billion. Small little consulting company, advice digital agency. But their stats have come out, if you follow them, where they have done so. People say there's no commerce in the metaverse. Like, they did something like 600 million over the last year, right? Then you look at now their model is a combination of real world and digital, so it's not all metaverse. In the same way, people look at when you look at the metaverse, and they say, look, why are people doing that? There's nothing happening in it. Well, first of all, when the internet came along, there was nothing else. So it was very early stage, and there were first movers, and there were people who got burned, etc. In the metaverse already exists in 2D fashion, maybe in the main, right? And it's gamers. And there's something like 3 billion gamers in the world. So there's already a high bar, right? And they're using these things. And when they look at what their expectations, they're obviously indexed towards the young demographic, but I have a couple of people who work for me are mad gamers, and they're well into their 40s and 50s. And so when you look at streaming is going to be part, in our view, of what happens in the metaverse. And the idea that you could go into that world. Like, here's a good example. In the Middle East, Muslim women often can't go shopping by themselves, right? Which just culturally, that's that's the way things work. Or if they go, it's with their husbands and with their helpers and all that, whatever way it works, right? But where some of this is going to happen, imagine you could stream live into your dining room, or you could have, the equivalent of the old Tupperware parties, where you can drop the shop into the living room of somebody, and the women of that part of the world could bring their friends in, and they could do the shopping in their store. Like, we have a product that that we've designed. It's like a Nike shop, and you can go in and you can imagine what a room looks like. You can change the colors, you can change the furniture. That's where we're headed, and live streaming is going to be part of that. So as a trend, again, live streaming is something we're very passionate about. We think it has huge potential, and it gives another outlet. So it's not something that's totally different. It just gives another outlet to creating, to allow you sell your goods. So when it could be something as simple as and this was, I believe, will happen in the future. Retailers, let's say the makeup counter, and the person's where they're putting the makeup on the lady or men or whoever it is, right? You will have an option where you can turn on the camera and people can look in at that. Like, that's the world we're in today. And then you'll be able to transact as you're moving. Or when periods are quiet, you'd say, okay, John or Mary, whoever, go into the green screen studio there and start selling. So it's this idea of just always on and always transacting. And that's what happens. That's what happens in China. But people like Kim Kardashian, the folks we're partnering with, and Lux and Wonder, and when Kim Kardashian did her first show in China, they worked with Tmall to make it happen. When Diane van Burstenberg, who's a client of ours as well in Mastercard, did her first show in China, they put it all together. That's where the world is moving. Like, we have an upcoming, we're working with the national TV station in Ireland to launch streaming in Ireland in the next number of months. And we believe it'll be a very interesting outlet for retailers, our merchants.
That's super interesting. And you said 75 to 80% of people buying have an interaction with
a streaming site.
With a streaming site. Wow, that's super
so it's
impressive.
phenomenal there, and it's a bit like the trend of the super apps. When the super apps first came out in China, and people said, when you look at the screen, you'd say, "Oh my God, how could anybody even navigate that?" But it's this idea of, I was paid in the early 2000s. I worked in a company in Modus Media and then in Orbiscom. And part of my job was to look at the trends every year and say what was happening, right? And at the start of every year, it would say, mobiles, this is the year of the mobile, right? And every year, mobile phone usage went up. So it was definitely getting more and more traction, even back when we'd been Nokia 1600s in our hands, etc. But it wasn't until 2008, when Apple launched the iPhone. That's when the world changed, because it turned the phone into a computer, right? And that idea of a computer in your hand. And in China, it is like, to watch people and how they use this stuff. They know that payment is there, but anybody from, like I've often said, when you see the beggars on the street using digital phones to collect their money, you better wake up and smell the roses. The world has changed, right? So China is one of the leading trend makers, despite people going, oh, it's all, they're trying to control the world and all that. They are one of the leading trend makers. And so we've always looked east as well. And that trend is coming this way. Yeah. And it's a bit like some people go, oh, well, that's not happening. No, Western people won't do that. Well, Western people use phones just as much as people in the eastern part of the world. So, yeah, I think it's going to happen.
I recently had an interesting conversation with one of the leaders at IKEA, and she was like, we were chatting about the future of quick commerce, because in Europe, in the US, we think that there's this feeling that it went too far. People will not do so much quick commerce in the future. But then if you look at China, then quick commerce and the data around commerce in general, it's so much more advanced. So it's not that it's impossible that our future is more into commerce in the ways we don't imagine today, or it's not true that quick commerce is dead already. We have a proof that it's well working in one of the biggest economies in the world right now. What do you think about this part? Like, we have this tendency to be hyped around things when the quick commerce first came to Europe, US, when the COVID started, but quickly to say it's dead when it gets any troubles.
Yeah, it's back to that land of the blind thing. So people love to be the forecaster, and some love to be the doomsmaker, right? So I say to my team, I talk about the law of economic certainty. It always takes longer. It costs more. You make less. How does your business plan for you now, right? So when we stand, there's that famous poem is "Things come dropping slowly." So I know our former CEO, you say he constantly get asked by CEOs, how do you predict the future? How do you see what's coming? Well, the reality is 10 minutes on the internet will show you what's coming. The only thing people can't do is predict the exact timing of when these things will come. AI is a good example. Metaverse is a good example. Lots of examples, right? And people would show you example of things that failed as proof that, look, this is going to take 5 to 10 years. Well, there's two things. One is that cycle of continuous improvement is accelerating. That's just fact, right? The access to the best technology in the world are getting cheaper. It's why people can create startups and in a couple of years sell them for big money because they may have solved a particular problem. And this is the whole thing. When I've always said, and I've been around this world a long time, technology is always about utility, right? And if you solve the utility, people will take up the technology. And the only thing that you can't predict is the exact timing. But so there's always that thing of who are the first movers versus the fast followers. That's happening in the metaverse today. People going, that's not going to work. But there's also, we have it's turned into a sort of a generally accepted term all across Mastercard, and we use it in our team. It's called test and learn. And that idea that if you get something and you go out to a customer and you show them, it doesn't need to be perfect. You can get that feedback. But streaming is a good example, because today there are probably people that say to us, "What, you've been at that 2 years, where you haven't done anything yet?" But we've learned an awful lot about streaming, and it's when that thing of where do you want to be in the wave? Is it the leading edge or the bleeding edge, or where? We're always trying to say, like, we don't want to be out in something that's going to happen in 5 years' time. Well, I mean, part of the business is paid to do that, but that's not what my team is paid to do. But to try and find the things that you can say to a customer, we can take that in now. We've learned the lessons, we've got the right partners, and we're going to help you move the needle. Like, here's a really great example. So Jeff Bezos first wrote his famous note to management in 2002, where he said, everything's going to be API-led, right? And Amazon does that today. But when you look at the marketplace, and in banking in particular is a good example, or in retailers, and if you talk about APIs, people glaze over. But APIs, effectively in this case, they're the language of conversion. They're the babble of technology, right? Where you're saying, actually, if you could put, as an example, if you had a library of all the best APIs in the world, covering everything from, say, KYC to AML to payments to whatever it might be to loyalty, you had that in one library, and it was all built, and a bit like open source software when it came, everybody dismissed it initially, but it became like such a huge thing today. There's big companies using open source that wouldn't have, even 5-6 years ago, would have said, oh no, we couldn't possibly do that because it might be flawed code, right? But in that API space is a good example. That's another trend that's coming more and more. And so that for startups, if they could, I'm old enough to remember back in the .com days, there was a thing called the Red Herring 100, and it was like a badge of honor that if you could get listed, it was a magazine, but digital magazine as well. If you could get listed in the top 100 in Red Herring, you were like the best. But if we had an ability to put all the best technology in the world, all the microservices into one vessel, and you could let the market decide which was the best, like that would democratize access to technology that isn't there today. So in some of these things, I think there's no easy answer. There's no light switch binary solution. And again, you listen to some people and you think, what planet have they landed down off, right? I remember a very famous big retailer, when we were working and we were developing a wallet product, and then they had a digital app, they had a loyalty app, they had a payments app, and then they were talking to us about creating a loyalty or a digital wallet, and we said, you do understand it's only one customer? And they said, no, you don't. It's like they open doorways and they meet in the middle. I was saying, it's like, what planet have you fallen down off? This is just about, there is a customer somewhere that has a need, and you have to put the utility in their hand. And sometimes that will be leading edge. And so people will try new things. Like you look at where payment meets loyalty today, where loyalty came out of the airline industry originally, and it was about rewards just for flying miles, right? But now it's a currency in itself. And so sometimes people are very quick to dismiss things like crypto today or blockchain, going, oh, look what happened. I knew it was always a disaster. I was saying it was a disaster. Now, there's people like the Warren Buffetts and Mungers of the world who say, well, they call it, I think I was watching a Munger on a CNBC the other day, and he says that crypto SH1T. He's saying he didn't believe in it, but you had very famous and very well-known investment managers that thought that it was much more than that, right? So, who's right or wrong? Well, who knows? Only time will tell, and it'll be looking back.
We'll see in 5 years or 10 years. It's true.
Yeah.
And we have 4 minutes to go only. And there are 2 more questions about your work and your team that I would like to ask. The first one is, if you could take us a bit behind the scenes, when in your role as SVP at Mastercard Ventures, what's your day of work like, or week of work like?
Yeah, it's varied, I'd say. I'm lucky enough to have, we're part of a division where like huge amounts of fierce smart people, and in digital labs particularly, like I have top-end developers, designers, videographers, etc. And I'm always shocked. Like I often feel like the most stupid person in the room, because I have people who are just brilliantly smart around technology and how they adapt technology. And so we could be having anything from a conversation, like here's a good example, where we have a bank that's launching a sort of metaverse product in the Middle East very shortly that we've developed for them. We have another bank in Germany that wants us to build out a digital high street with e-commerce in it, in the metaverse. We have banks who would be looking at, I was on a call yesterday with a bank in Latin America, and they're looking at that whole thing of how do they deal with startups. Like we have a program in Mastercard called Start Path with about 300 companies that have gone through it, and they're some of the best companies in the world in terms of emerging tech. And they're saying, how could we adapt to that, and how could we use your capability to access that content? So it tends to be very varied. I think one of the best jobs in Mastercard. I think the power, or the most enjoyable part of what we do, though, is that everything we do starts with the customer. So I used to say to customers, even when I first started, I said to customers, we have nothing to sell, only our capability. But by creating intimacy and trust with the customer, and they tell you their burning platforms are the most important problems, that's a great place to start any business conversation. My dear dad, who's long passed, he said to me, if you're sitting opposite somebody, he was in sales, right? And you say, if you're sitting opposite someone, if you're not driving value into the conversation immediately, he said, you should leave the room. So I think that's what keeps me buzzed, is customers who say to us, look, I've got this real problem, how can you help me? And when you're helping people like that, you get a great buzz out of it. And so, even though, as I joke about my wife saying, she said, why are you in technology? You can't wire a plug. But where I'm, I think, reasonably strong is about connecting dots. But it's about a team. And I say to my team, there's no I in we. And so it's about the power of the team is what has made it successful. And then the power of being part of a company like Mastercard that genuinely, a bit like digital was all those years ago, notwithstanding that, they failed because of one core assumption. But in the same way, Mastercard is a company that you can partner. And when they say, I know of I raised a lot of money for a fabulous semiconductor company a number of years ago. And you just go to the Valley all the time. And in one of the biggest brands in the Valley, you'd walk in, you'd have an appointment with one person, 15 people would walk into the room, and 14 of them wouldn't introduce themselves. You knew you weren't in a partnering discussion, right? Whereas Mastercard genuinely has that thing of, they will share their knowledge and understanding because they're trying to be a force accelerator for their customers to help them grow their business and future-proof their business. And that's what the core of what we do is around that.
And the final question from our audience. James, how does Mastercard foster digital acceleration mindset within the team? What's your approach to fostering new, bold ideas?
So Mastercard Labs first started in Mastercard about 10 years ago. And so that became a sort of a quarterback in the process of innovation and demystifying innovation into very practical things. We say evidence defeats disbelief. And sometimes when you listen to technologists, they're so in love with their own technology, they miss the fact it's about utility and customers at the end of the day, right? So I think Mastercard has embraced that as a philosophy all across their own company, and it has become, like we would be known, in various things have won awards around how we foster innovation. In my team, we're in front of customers every day who are asking us to help them innovate. Now, some innovation, I had a great lesson once when I first started. We had I can mention the bank because it was public, and Lloyd's Bank came to us and they wanted to do something around, they wanted to do something very innovative in the credit space, and they had a sponsor, very senior sponsor, kept saying it has to be very innovative. And it was a buy now, pay later round, and they were the first to launch buy now, pay later in the UK market. And I kept saying to them when we were doing this launch pad, is this innovative enough? Is this innovative enough? And I learned a great lesson. They said, it's innovative enough for us, right? So part of what fosters innovation is, certainly in my team, it's customers who have a need and they're saying, and we have a deadline, we say innovation loves a deadline. So, and we have got, let's say, proven skills, tools and competencies that allow us help do that. Like we get told, every week by banks or by merchants that we've worked with airlines, we've worked with shipping lines, we've worked with cruise liners, we've worked with, obviously banks because of a core part. But it's that thing of a customer trusting enough to say, we're trying to get across that particular chasm, how can we do it? And I've always said to CEOs, look, if we don't have the answer, we'll find it in Mastercard. If Mastercard don't have the answer, we'll find it with our vendors. So it could be Netguru or whoever, right? And so that idea that, if you're in Mastercard, because of the reputation it has as a brand, you can get in any door in the world, right? Whether you stay inside the door, it depends on who you bring with you. If you bring the best angle grinder in the world into the room, the customer doesn't say, why did you bring me the best angle grinder? They say, is Mastercard's name over the door? So partly, and this is a very important point, when you're listening to people talk about innovation, the natural tendency, bankers, particularly bankers in Europe and America, they survived 2008. So they think that this disruption thing is a load of nonsense. Like we had 2008, we got through that, right? But today, when you look at customers and they're saying, we have a particular need, there's often they're looking for, this idea of, I want the new mousetrap, I want this breakthrough thing. Actually, a lot of good innovation is about bringing proven capabilities to the table. Netguru is a good example, where you say, look, if we bring Netguru into the room and they build us something that someone else built previously, but they build it really well, it doesn't have to be to always breakthrough. So a lot of innovation, the first half of the first 20 years of the century, a lot of it was about, the new things. Today, good innovation is also about bringing proven capabilities that de-risk the execution curve for a customer. That's innovation too, and often that point is missed.
All right, that's a brilliant final thought, James. Thank you very much for joining today. Thank you for all of the insights. And to everyone watching, thank you for joining us, and see you on the next episode.
Brilliant. Thank you, Marek.
Thank you very much.
Bye now. Thank you.